Hello, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at another one of our comparative economics webinar. We're delighted to have today Professor Sascha Becker. Before introducing him, I would just like to remind you of the house rules. We have during the talk, if you have any clarification questions or other type of questions, please type them in using the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. Once Sascha has finished his talk, please raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question live. We are absolutely delighted to have Professor Sascha Becker today. He currently holds the Shelka Young Chair and is professor of economics at Monash University in Melbourne, and also still affiliated with the University of Warwick in the UK. Sascha, it's a huge pleasure to have you here. We're really looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. This is actually a bit of an unusual webinar or seminar in that it is about a paper that was already published just 14 days ago. So it seemed to fit well with a comparative economics theme. So I asked Nauro whether that would be okay, and he said yes. So let me talk about this joint research with Lukas Mergele and Ludger Wößmann from Munich. And what we do in this paper is that we look at German division and reunification. What happened there, a bit of a historical look back, is that after World War II, Germany was split in two parts, and the western part was called the Federal Republic of Germany. All that happened in 1949. And the eastern part was called the German Democratic Republic, one of my favorite misnomers in history. And from a pre-World War II perspective, this was completely unexpected. So if you had asked someone in 1930 whether it's conceivable that Germany 15 years later, 20 years later would be decimated and split into several parts, probably very few people would have expected that. So it's tempting to consider post-1990 differences when the two Germanys were reunited as the result of the division over 4 decades, and to attribute the differences that we see today as an effect of the GDR. Now, what we do in this paper is to ask whether indeed living in the GDR can be considered as an exogenous treatment. What you will do is to first show that there are East-West differences already before World War II. And then we will also show some evidence that maybe the war itself differentially affected West and East. Then before the two Germanys became states, they were occupied, the western part by the US, the UK and France, the East by the Soviets. And also in that period, maybe the two halves were treated differently. And then the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain were really only closed fully in 1961. So if someone really was super keen to leave the GDR or move into the GDR, there was a time window when that could happen. And also that migration may have an effect on how we interpret differences that we see after 1990. What we also do in the paper is that we then survey existing literature and we give some views about how that literature addresses these issues that we raise in the first 2 points on this slide, but I won't touch on that today. What I will do is just give a relatively high-level description of what we think that literature shows, despite the caveats that I listed in the top half. And what we don't do, and also on that I want to be super clear, we haven't formally re-estimated papers in the existing literature. And that's also what the JP didn't want us to do. And that would have been a mega exercise to take dozens of papers, get the code and whatever, do some formal re-estimation. Instead, we just want to point out humbly that one has to be careful when looking at different political regimes and using borders, more generally speaking. I myself have done border designs using historic borders to see persistence over time. And I may be a culprit myself in using this and not always carefully having checked whether these borders pre-existed. Anyway, so the point is more one conceptually, that if we are interested in the results of different political regimes and different outcomes, we have to pay very careful attention to the borders, but also to the process that led to a change in systems and maybe the ensuing migration into or out of different regimes. But what the JP was keen on was that before we delve into the specifics, that we should, for the general readership of the JP, also say something at the very macro level and say whether communism at first sight was a success or not. And to do that, we just take GDP figures. And of course, GDP figures, especially in communist regimes, have their own issues because it was not a regular regime that would collect the same kinds of statistics that we are used to, and it wasn't a free market. But still, the best numbers that economic historians have put together seem to suggest that the two Germanys before World War II were roughly similar in terms of GDP per capita. But then by the end of 40 years of communism, GDP per capita in Eastern Germany was less than half of that in the West. So at that very high level, communism doesn't strike us immediately as a success in terms of macroeconomic outcomes. So what we then talk mostly about is the growing literature on the effects of the GDR. And I should say right away, we are not in the name and shame business, and it's not about trashing a literature, but just putting a note that one has to be careful when reading published results, and people who are still working in this literature or are planning to do work may want to be more careful on certain dimensions. So all of us, we love this literature, but still one shouldn't take exogeneity for granted just because maybe some papers make a good case that in their specific context, the GDR is close to being exogenous, that extends to any study you possibly want to ever do on the GDR. So let me start from Alesina and Fuchs-Schündel's path-breaking Goodbye Lenin, which is a fantastic paper. That paper says, and I'm quoting here word by word, since the political and economic system has been the same in the eastern and western parts of Germany since reunification in 1990 and was the same before 1945, West Germans constitute a meaningful control group for East Germans. Therefore, comparing the differences in attitudes and preferences of Germans after reunification can give us a clue about the effects of living for 45 years under a communist regime on attitudes, beliefs, and political preferences. So that path-breaking paper was looking at attitudes and preferences for Germans. And that particular paper, Alesina Fuchs-Schündel, is quite careful in looking at pre-existing differences between the two Germanys. And some other papers in the literature have been equally careful, but not necessarily each and every paper that has used the GDR. And all too often we feel people refer to earlier work, and in particular Alesina Fuchs-Schündel, as having shown that the GDR is a quasi-natural experiment, and hence now for the new outcomes of interest in follow-up work, people may not necessarily always take the same care of looking at pre-existing differences and various other issues. But even those that have taken account of potential pre-existing differences have not always done so in a formal way, in the sense of, say, throwing in pre-World War II controls on the right-hand side. But sometimes these comparisons have been at a relatively aggregate descriptive level. So what's the broader context to this? There is a literature that explores how political systems persistently affect the economy and population preferences. And a particular focus there has been put on legacies between capitalist and socialist societies. And a paper in the Annual Review of Political Science a couple of years ago by Simsa and co-authors has given an overview of that literature. So we think that maybe what we say about the GDR may also apply to some extent further afield. And studies that examine a major political event like the arrival or departure of communism or other forms of autocracy or generally regime changes might face similar challenges when interpreting the before and after differences as a natural experiment. The ways in which borders are drawn and events that take place during a transition, which typically isn't just one day, but there is a lead up to a regime change, and then there is a period where the new regime settles in. Maybe a period where we see in and out migration, and people who are particularly passionate about loving or hating a regime may either migrate out or in. So for border designs more generally, not just the GDR, one should maybe be careful about whether borders follow pre-existing province, country, state borders, and to the extent that certain outcomes vary because of previous political regimes that may have affected preferences and behaviors in certain ways. If those borders are the same and overlap with the ones that the regime of interest has around it, some of what we attribute to that new regime may in fact be a reflection of things past. So how did we get to look into this issue? It was a bit by coincidence. We were working on completely unrelated stuff. And we're in fact looking at the relationship between church attendance and education. So looking at whether causality goes one or the other way. And in the context of that, we were reading work by Lucian Hölscher, who is a church historian, not an economist. And he has done tremendous work over various decades where he collected from the archives church attendance statistics in the Protestant church in Germany in the 19th and 20th century. And in his, what he calls the Atlas of the Geography of Protestantism, there is a map which is displayed on this slide where he shows church attendance in 1910. And he describes that graph where, if you see my mouse moving here, this is where the GDR border would be here. He describes this as the GDR shimmering through in 1910. And he says verbally, this suggests the conjecture that in large parts of East Germany, it was not the socialist regime that first eroded and undermined ecclesiastical life, but rather that, conversely, an already older unchurchliness in these regions paved the way for the reception of socialist convictions. So Hölscher says, well, looking at 1910, well ahead of the GDR, there is one particular variable that may not necessarily be of interest to all economists, church attendance, but in that variable, we see the GDR border shimmering through. Then other work that we also came across early on by Sebastian Klüsener and Goldstein, first appeared in 2009, follow-up work in 2016, describes a divide in demographic behavior regarding fertility and marriage that predates the division of Germany into communist East and capitalist West, as the regions that were later to become East Germany witnessed higher non-marital fertility from at least the middle of the 19th century. So describing yet an outcome that's not strictly speaking directly hardcore economics, but still cultural behavior, higher extramarital fertility rates in the East already 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So how did the GDR come about? So how did that border of the GDR arise in the first place? In 1943, as the forces fighting against Nazi Germany anticipated a defeat of the Nazi regime, instituted the European Advisory Commission, the EAC, which was agreed on at the Moscow conference, confirmed in Tehran, and whose job was to explore the political framework for post-war Europe. So that commission met in London and explored various possibilities of how the map in Europe would look like, and in particular what to do about Germany in order to contain it in the future and make it less of an aggressive power. The first EIC protocol on the zones of occupation in Germany that is displayed in a map here was a secret map not known to the general public that had the idea of splitting up Germany into 3 occupation zones, a British one, a US one, and a Soviet one. There was a slight rearrangement between the French and US zones, but the Soviet zone remained the same. And the final protocol of the EIC in July 1945 then also gave some space to the French in the western part, but the Soviet bit in the east remained the same. What came in was that Poland would become an independent country again. So, but the border between the 2 Germanys, or what ended up being the 2 Germanys then in 1945, was already delineated in September 1944, so well before the end of World War II. So one might have expected that maybe the border between the 2 Germanys is where the tanks stood in May 1945 when World War II ended, but that's not the case. So this map that we see now has in black the actual border between the 2 Germanys, and this pink area was an area that the US had conquered by May 1945. So US tanks were along this line that I'm showing here with my mouse, but the Americans followed the agreement in the EIC protocols and withdrew from that area, so that in fact the border that had been delineated already in 1944 became the border between the 2 Germanys. So what is that border? It turns out that it follows nearly one-to-one pre-existing state and province borders of the previous German Empire and Prussia as the biggest state inside the German Empire. So it follows pre-existing political units, subunits of the German Empire. Why that? As the US Department of State reported in 1968 about the discussions that were held in the EIC, especially the British delegation was keen that it would be pre-existing states such as Thuringia, Saxony, Hesse, Bavaria, in order to encourage rather than prejudice any separatist or particularist tendencies. So providing a safeguard against the revival of the former German state. So the idea was, if we keep these states intact, then maybe the local pride of the Thuringians, of the Saxons, etc., if anything, would lead to a call to break up and have smaller units, but it would decrease the risk that a German empire in its old form would come back from the ashes. These borders are not, in our view, endogenous in the sense of the Soviets and Americans and Brits handpicking the different areas, but it's roughly splitting Germany into 3/3. And then the French came in and that changed the shares a little bit, but the original idea was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And obviously the Soviets would get the eastern third, yeah? So they didn't pick, and we are not arguing that the Soviets looked at some pre-World War II statistics and said, oh, this is what we want because that's the most communist-prone area in the country. But the borders are where they are because they follow pre-existing state or province borders. But here's some food for thought going beyond the GDR example. How about other borders drawn somewhere in the world as a consequence of wars and regime changes? What were the processes there that led to the borders where they are or where they are not? So here's a first example of a map that we show in the paper, where we display the working class share in the different parts of Germany. All of this is at the county level in 1925. So that is one of the censuses in the Weimar era. and the working class share measures blue-collar workers. And you see that as a whole, the GDR has a substantially darker blue, so a higher share of blue-collar workers, working class people, than the West. This is not to say that all the industrial areas or the working class was exclusively in the GDR. Obviously, also in the Rhine-Ruhr area in the West, you have a high share. But for the two Germanys as a whole, the East is clearly substantially more working class than the West. So at least papers that just use East-West dummies may be overlooking this important variation, that at the aggregate level, the two Germanys are so different. We then look at various other outcomes, the manufacturing employment share, which is highly correlated to the working class share. Similar thing, the East has a higher manufacturing employment share than the West. Self-employment, another interesting outcome where it has often been argued that the East of Germany, being communist, was training the entrepreneurial spirit out of people, and that communism made people less entrepreneurial. But these maps suggest that maybe there were some pre-existing differences in the self-employment share. And some of that may be still reflected persistently over several decades and across the GDR and today's outcomes. We then move to political outcomes, because the most natural thing to look at when we look at different political regimes, communism and democracy, is that maybe that reflects then also in voting outcomes today. And again, here we look at potential differences in vote shares before World War II. And the most natural thing to look at, talking about communism, is maybe the communist vote share itself. And it turns out that that was double as high in the East than in the West. The West had a communist vote share overall of roughly 5%. The East had 10%. I should say that all of these outcomes are obviously to some extent correlated. Where you have a higher working class share, you may also have a higher share of communist voters. And it happens to be the case that where the industrial areas in the East are, you also have a higher communist vote share. And where you have a higher working class share in the West, you also have higher communist vote shares. But still, again, also communist voting is higher in the East than in the West already in 1924. We picked 1924, by the way, because the Nazis became big and influential from 1925 onwards, and we wanted to keep it clean of the complication of the Nazi party influencing voting patterns later on. But we find similar results still also for other elections in the Weimar era. We can also go beyond the communist vote share and add also the SPD, the Social Democrats, and the USPD, a split of the SPD. And also there we find substantial differences when we look at that more aggregate left-wing vote in the East compared to the West. Then moving on to what we package under the label of culture, we look at the share of Protestants in the East compared to the West, because growing literature on religion economics has shown that also religious denominations influence economic behaviors. So since the city of Wittenberg, the place where Martin Luther was operating from, is here in the heartland of what became the GDR, roughly where my mouse is here, it isn't surprising that the East is more Protestant, because that's the Protestant heartland, whereas places like Bavaria and parts of the south of Germany, west of Germany are more Catholic. So the East has roughly 90% Protestants. The West overall has just 50%. Yeah? And I should also say at this point, and I should have said it earlier, we are not arguing that always there is a discrete jump at the border. It's not that point that literally for each and every outcome, there is a discrete jump exactly where the border is. But to the extent that lots of work looks at East-West dummies, it may ignore that overall the two parts of the country are quite different. Then using these church attendance statistic, that is essentially the map that I showed you earlier from Hölscher, reworked and brought to just the West and East and not the German Empire as a whole, We see again that church attendance in the East was lower than in the West. And here, it's also interesting to note that for certain outcomes, it is maybe a starker contrast, even right at the border, in this part of the border where Bavaria meets Thuringia or where Thuringia meets Hessia. And the changes in the northern part of the border are sometimes not as stark as in the southern part of the border. Finally, returning to the extramarital birth ratios, which are mentioned by Klüsener-Goldstein, where we see here that that is far higher in the East than in the West, and female labor force participation, another of the outcomes that is often associated with communism, because the communists were keen to get women to work, and that also partly because they wanted to influence kids by getting them into nurseries and influencing their socialist education from early on. It turns out that female labor force participation in the East was already somewhat higher than in the West in 1925. So this is all about pre-World War II differences. All of them here just shown as regression coefficients, always the West as the constant term, and then the East here displayed. And you see there is in all these outcomes that I described, working class share, manufacturing, employment, communist vote share, the cultural variables, gender, etc. We always see quite substantial East-West differences. In table form, it is exactly this column here, the full German sample, that is shown in these graphs. What we then do is to say, well, of course, lots of people have looked into border designs or have run this regression discontinuity designs. And I was quite open with you that in a lot of these maps, there isn't a discrete jump at the border necessarily, or in every part of the border. But what we show is that as we look at bands around the border, 200 kilometers plus minus, or 100, or only looking at the contiguous counties, the ones that touch the border, even there, for most outcomes, we still see differences. So even an RDD is not a magic bullet to get around these issues of pre-existing differences. Okay? Are there any questions now, or should I move on?
Yes. We have one question by Benedict Fritz. He asks regarding the self-employment share. Aren't East-West differences primarily driven by the South being much more agricultural and kind of subsistence farming oriented than the East, which was together with the rural area more industrial? Where does this leave us in terms of the East being less entrepreneurial pre-World War II, as agriculture isn't exactly classic entrepreneurial activity? Then this is the first question on self-employment. Yeah. And then we have a second question by Jan Fiedremuts. How were the borders of West Berlin determined, also following pre-war borders? These are the two questions we have right now.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, on the agriculture question, yeah, there is something to it. And Bavaria was highly agricultural, but so was large parts of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. So again, as I said at various points, it's not the case that the East should be seen as homogeneous and the West as homogeneous. Each of them have their different qualities and their own within heterogeneity. But as a whole, papers that just look at West-East dummies may be cutting things too short. Yeah? But clearly, some of the self-employment variation is also driven by differences in agricultural shares. But there is work by Michael Wirwig that looks into that in more detail, and that may be of interest to read. Who takes a lot of care also to look at sectoral differences in the self-employment share. Then on the West-East Berlin thing, that's an excellent question, because I should have stressed that all of these numbers that I'm showing you always explicitly exclude Berlin. So we are talking about the counties in the East, in Eastern Germany, excluding Berlin. So we haven't even provided maps for the within Berlin division. And I wouldn't even be 100% sure whether the wall follows pre-existing within Berlin quarter divisions in each and every point or not, since we are not covering that. Okay, let me move on. So far we've talked about pre-World War II differences, but another issue that may be relevant is the differential effectiveness by World War II. Now, both of my grandfathers were also involved in World War II, and one of them first fought on the Western Front, and then everyone was moved east and so on. So it turns out that the war was somewhat more severe in terms of its effect on death, etc., on the Eastern Front. And to the extent that soldiers from the east of Germany were generally more likely to fight on the Eastern Front, it doesn't surprise that maybe more people that originated from the East got killed in World War II. So what we did here is we took the first German census from 1946, and we look at sex ratios. And before World War II, the sex ratio, so ratio of men to women, was roughly the same between East and West. After World War II in 1946, the sex ratio in the East is substantially lower. And in the British zone, it would be 0.83, French zone 0.79, but in the Soviet zone, it's 0.74. Yeah, so it's the lowest of all the occupation zones in the Soviet zone. And this may reflect, on the one hand, war casualties, as I just described, but we also can't exclude that it's a sex imbalance resulting from early gender biased east-west migration. If more men go from the east to the west between the end of World War II and that census in October 46, that could also explain these differences, but clearly they are there. And to the extent that the GDR starts in 1949, it may have taken off with these gender imbalances. And what we know from the literature is that sex ratios affect labor market outcomes. Work by Angrist, Bönke, Gay shows that female labor force participations are influenced by sex ratios. But even in recent work by Baranov and co-authors, there is effects of gender imbalances on gender roles and even political outcomes. Yeah. Then another point that we weren't aware of before we started working on this quite a number of years ago is that the manufacturing census of 1936 shows that sales per employee, a very bad rough proxy for productivity, in the East was lower than in the West. And what the Soviets did is that they took reparations in the form of taking capital away. So they would literally sometimes take factories, put them on trains and ship them over to the Soviet Union. So even if the East had arrived in 1945, destroyed or not destroyed to the same extent, the period of Soviet occupation led to a differential dismantling of existing infrastructure, productive capacity, that may then have hampered the GDR in taking off. So one person who has done a lot on these East-West comparisons on the production side and at the more macro aggregate side, Schleifer, is arguing that the West German industrial capital stock in 1948 was higher than in 36, whereas the East German capital stock was only at 69% of its 1936 level. So all of that tells us that the combination of war and Soviet occupation may have hit the East more. And these are the numbers that give the comparisons in terms of damages, dismantling, reparations, occupation costs, and argues that East Germans paid a far higher amount in terms of Reichsmarks per capita than the West. Now, East-West migration. As I said in the introduction, the wall was built in 1961. By no means was the border fully open until 1961. There were border checks and all that, but the wall that made it really near impossible to cross within Berlin, and the Iron Curtain delineating the West from the East were nearly impenetrable only from 1961. Berlin was key, and that's where Jan Federmuth's question comes in. Insofar as Berlin was quite open, the two parts, West and East, until 1961, people would commute, live in the West, work in the East, and vice versa. And there the wall was key because that was still a gateway to get out of the GDR easily. So what turns out, if you look at statistics, is that by 1961, when the Berlin Wall was built, about 20% of the population that was residing there or living in what became the GDR in 1945, 20% of that population had migrated west. From the migration literature, we know that typically migration is selective. It's not a random draw. It's not like people flip a coin and decide to leave, but people decide, they optimize. And also that is visible in the east-west migration patterns. Just to give some examples there, in 1945, the Christian Democratic Union, so the party of Konrad Adenauer and Angela Merkel, was founded across all occupation zones. And in these first years under occupation, there were still democratic elections also in the East. And in the first years after 1945, the CDU was in charge of various governments, even in the East. But all CDU ministers resigned voluntarily or by force and migrated to the West. So to the extent that these were representatives of democratic conservative parties, those people had to leave or left by their own account. The Soviet occupation forces and then later the East German government also expropriated many large landowners and used denazification to expel not only Nazis, but also those they perceived as critical to communist rule. And also that may have triggered selective migration. So what we do here is we draw on existing work by Bauernschuster, Feyergold, Heblich, already 8 years ago, who used the German microcensus 1971. That is, insofar, a cool data set, as it asked as one of the census questions whether you had been born in the West or whether you had been born in the East. So this is covering people living in West Germany in 1971, but where we know where they come from. So what you can do with that data is to compare the East-West movers to the local West Germans. And looking at these characteristics, it turns out that the East-West movers are much more likely to be white-collar workers, 30% versus 20. They are more likely to be civil servants, 13-6, and they are more likely to be self-employed, 10-7. Also in terms of education, they are less likely to be just basically schooled, and they are more likely to have a university degree and higher degrees overall. Yeah? So that all underlines selective migration. Also from yet another data set that also has this origin in the West or in the East question, we know that these people that migrated West have see a lesser role for the state. So that may reflect then also in a lesser role for this, or a higher role for the state for those who stay behind in the East. Now, not everyone will necessarily have migrated only because of conviction about political preferences, but Eder and Haller argue that a lot of people migrated fleeing the Soviets as they approached at the end of World War II. But still there is anecdotal evidence that there is selectivity by age, health, and family status. And not all of that can be captured by these statistics in 1971 in the microcensus. And I saw your hand now, 1 second. But the president of the statistical office of the Soviet occupation zone famously said that the Soviet occupation zone acted like a sieve, holding back the aged, sick, and single. So that, again, speaks to potential selectivity. So what we think is that those who stayed were probably more receptive to GDR doctrine. I'm not saying they are diehard communists, but at least they were not as passionate about leaving as the ones who left. So that may be a case of selection into political systems. No, sorry.
Yes, thank you, Sascha. We just have a clarification question on your last set of interesting results. Jan Fiedremuth asks, what about migration and location choices of German refugees from areas annexed by Poland and the USSR, Sudetenland, and other places in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, so these statistics I'm giving here, they use those, that is by where people resided in 1939. And here we are only picking people who resided in 1939 in what became the GDR. So we are not touching here on the refugees. That has also been covered in various papers because some of these data sets here also then tell you whether someone comes from, say, East Prussia, but we focus exclusively in this table on people whose origin is in what became the GDR. Yeah.
That's great.
Okay, but then another interesting point is there also was west to east migration, and that a lot of Germans don't know, and if anything, they would think that is just a small number of very crazy people. But it turns out that 500,000 people migrated from the west to the east. One of them, by the way, Angela Merkel as a child. She was born in Hamburg, but her father was a Protestant pastor, and he received a pastorate in Brandenburg and also seems wanted to help in the east. And then she as a child, alongside her parents, went there. The East German government described this 500,000 people that went from the west to the east as, on the one hand, young men trying to escape compulsory military service in the west. And there are some stories like that. That was a motive for some young men. And they say these are people not in agreement with a capitalist system. So they pitched it for their own political gain. And in the same way, the West described people fleeing from the East as people not in agreement with the communist system. So both of that underlines this selective migration into or out of political systems. Also interesting is the fact that the Politburo, which ran the country in its early years, 1949 to 61, so before the Berlin Wall, had 19 members in total over that whole period. And out of those, 6 were born in the West, including Honecker himself, who was then also the last GDR leader. So some of the most strongly convinced communists, the ones who are willing to run the country under a communist regime, came from the West, and they deliberately selected into building the East German state. So additional aspects of migration. I described selective migration. Another thing for identification that may matter is not only is there selective migration, but if diehard capitalist thinkers leave the East and communism lovers go from the West to the East, it increases sorting and messes up the respective control group. But what one of the referees said and what we subscribe to is, okay, not every paper is about the GDR per se, some are about communism, and you could argue that a broader take on the effect of communism includes the Soviet occupation period. And that's an absolutely fair point. And if we see the selective migration, it is, of course, itself potentially a result of communism. Yeah? So it is part of the outcome one should be interested in. So it depends really very much on what the research question is people have, where and which of these issues matters. So what we then do in the paper is we give an overview of existing literature, and I reiterate, it's not a name and shame game, and the JEP is not the JEL. So they explicitly told us, no, don't discuss 100 papers, just pick some and tell us what's the takeaway. So we try to do that and be careful and not overstate, because let me reiterate, we are not re-estimating existing papers, throwing in variables from before World War II or controlling for selective migration. We are just giving a rough assessment of whether we think existing work is either an overestimate or underestimate, or maybe not affected at all by these issues we raised. So on Twitter, we were happy to read when someone wrote, and they provide an admirably balanced and kindly interpretation of existing work. So that, just to underline that it's not trying to trash a literature, but just trying to give a little note on what to take care of when reading it or when working on it now or in the future. So let me make some general observations about empirical work that may be less prone to issues, or what may be more problematic than other approaches. So we think that generally papers that just use a GDR dummy may be more problematic in terms of the criticisms we raise. And even border samples or RDDs are not necessarily a magic bullet. So what some papers do, and some combine various empirical approaches, is that they focus on convergence after 1990. So they try to complement results that look pretty soon after 1990 and combine it with convergence after 1990. And if political systems, more generally speaking, have a role, then not only would they leave a trace in 1990 or 1992, 95, but we should maybe then also after 95 until 2020 see some convergence between East and West, now that the two parts of the country are under the same political system. And lots of papers show such results, but also some show that differences persist through the next 30 years. What papers more recently have started to do, and we think that's very useful, is that they try to come up with continuous measures of communism, or rather exposure to communism. So some people have used years under communism, arguing someone who lived 30 years under communism has received more of a communist treatment than someone who lived only 10 years under the communist system. People looking at socialist education have used birth date cutoff designs to say, okay, this kid was born in January, the next kid in February, one went to school 10 years under communism, one only 9, and use this kind of variation. And a lot of positive things can come from using geographic variation within the GDR. So not to say, okay, GDR, but communism may have been differentially strong, or the experience of communism may have been more positive or negative for certain people, and draw some insight from that. So what people have done is, for instance, use exposure to Western influence, where TV coverage, radio coverage, visits from Westerners to the East. Also communist priming. Some cool results use the fact that in communist model cities like Karl Marx City, people may have been more brainwashed that communism is a good thing, and they may behave differently, and people show that matters. And then also what seems to matter is particularly negative experiences with communism. People in border areas who were shut off and were often considered to be suspicious in helping people try to get out of the GDR seem to have differential behavior from people living more inland away from the border. And people who've been subject to a lot of pollution are also people who may have a very bad memory of the GDR, and their behavior today may be different from those who were less affected by that. Okay, so let me come to a conclusion and give you a takeaway. So what this paper tries to say is that German division and reunification is not a straightforward natural experiment. I'm not saying it's of no use whatsoever. All I'm saying is one has to be careful, and the fact that some papers may do a good job because their outcomes are less affected by these various points I made is not a magic bullet for every single paper that looks at any outcome you can come up with. So each research question requires individual consideration of these points that we discussed. But what are results that we think survive even after making the points or addressing the points we just raised? So we think that living under the East German regime did affect preferences to some extent. What we learned from convergence after 1990 is that indeed some economic behaviors and political, more than social, attitudes between the two parts of Germany have converged, and that suggests that political regimes matter, and that now being reunited again under the Western regime ultimately affects people's preferences and behaviors. Interestingly, trust is one of these things. Trust in the state has gone up rapidly in the East, but social trust, trusting other people in the East, still seems to be lower. And there is work that talks about spying and long-run effects of spying, that you can't trust anyone, that still affects people's behavior today. And also gender roles seem to have been permanently affected by communism. Even though, let me repeat that, some of the differences in gender roles go back to pre-World War II, but still we think a lot of it can be attributed also to communism. But in order to get a magnitude of how much is an effect of communism and how much is pre-existing would require a very careful look into these various issues we raised. So more generally speaking, we think an avenue for future research is to study more generally the endogeneity of political systems. Maybe one day the two Koreas get reunited, and also there, the question will be, where is the border today? Does it follow pre-existing Korean borders of provinces from whatever, Japanese occupation, and even before that? And I'm actually already working with a Korean PhD student to lay the ground, if it happens through my lifetime that Korea gets reunited, to look into that. But also it applies also to more historic papers. I did some work on the Habsburg Empire, and other people have done work on all kinds of borders, and it requires always a careful look at what these borders were before a specific regime of interest. And regime changes, to close up, are not random and often trigger selective migration of those who feel most strongly for or against the regime. And the final thing to close is a bonus graph, some good news. Also, life expectancy had fallen behind in the East and was roughly 2 years below in the East compared to the West, but that gap has closed. So let me close on that positive note.
Thank you very much, Sascha. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. We still have about 7 minutes for discussion, which is excellent. Then the way we proceed is if you can raise your hand, I will unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself. If I okay, somebody raised their hands. Okay, I will allow Jan to talk. Now unmute Jan. Wait, Jan. Jan, I think we can hear you.
Okay, is it working?
Yes, it's working great. Yes, thank you.
All right, great. Yes, so I asked about West Berlin, and I understand you excluded it from your analysis, essentially because of the issues with being kind of exceptional, not following the pre-war borders, unlike the rest of East Germany. But wouldn't that be actually a reason to look specifically at the differences between East and West Berlin to see what was the legacy of communism, comparing people who were originally in the same city, and then some of them found themselves in the Western occupation zone, some of them found themselves in the Soviet zone. Wouldn't that be a particularly interesting natural experiment? Thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of that can still be done. In terms of pre-war statistics, I know less about the situation in Berlin and how much is available at the sub-city level, because that's probably what you would like to do. Otherwise, you just have two units, West and East. But yeah, that's definitely interesting to see. I mean, the period 1949 or 1945 to 1961 in Berlin is slightly more complicated because the border was more or less open and people could commute for work. So that muddies the waters a bit more. But one can think about questions where one can then exploit the post-61 period nevertheless, definitely. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Let me see if there is any other. Okay, doesn't look like there's any other hand, at least not that I can see. Let me just take the chair privilege and just ask one question for a change. Very, very brief. Sascha, I mean, this is a great take on a literature that can be kind of characterized as looking at the GDR from the West. Okay, let me just simplify for the sake of clarity. But there is also another quite large literature that looks at DDR from the East, in which the rapidity of unification ameliorated the effects of communism and hence worked biased the effects the other way. I mean, I don't know if you have had a chance to look at it. I'd like just to see kind of what are your thoughts about this other perspective, and how does it perhaps econometrically works out?
Well, there is maybe this macro level aspect to your question, that it has often been argued that different from communist countries away from Germany, which weren't the same nation, and where there wasn't anything like unification, the West had to act quickly and set the parameters of unification quickly, because otherwise there would have been even larger scale migration after 1989 from the East to the West. And that's why they did conversion at parity between the two currencies and the like. What is important to point out, and I'm not sure I mentioned that sufficiently, is one issue that the convergence literature has potentially is that also after 1990 there is migration. Some people leave early from the East to the West, maybe not trusting whether regime change from communism to the capitalist system is stable. But also a lot of people then started moving from the West to the East and helping build up the industrial landscape and so on. And that migration may to some extent also have led to convergence by migration, because Western people move to the East, and that then affects attitudes over there. But definitely there is also this take of seeing it from the East.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have a final question because it's we have 2 minutes to close officially the talk by Shenki Ni. I will try to allow you to talk. I'm pushing my luck maybe, but unmute. Yeah, you should be able to.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yeah, I see two plots. One is the difference of GDP per capita between East and West Germany. And the last figure is about the life expectancy. Why there is no difference in terms of life expectancy between East and Western Germany?
I think that the health system, or generally the welfare state institutions in the East, were quickly brought to Western levels, and that has helped life expectancy increases relatively quickly.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
All right. We are at 1 o'clock sharp London time. Then I would like to thank all the participants. I would like to thank Sascha for the great presentation. And I will officially close the seminar now, which means that the video version that goes into the website will be cut now. But because it's, I presume, 10 p.m. in Melbourne. Is it 10 p.m.?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, we can have a informal kind of happy hour chat. Sascha can have a well-deserved nightcap if you want. It's past 5 o'clock. But I will close officially the seminar now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you.
Hope to see you next week. Thank you. Okay.